Grab your cowboy hats, everybody, because we are in the wild, wild west of the world of artificial intelligence.
This place is like the wild, wild west, man.
These models are developing so quickly, and new technology is becoming available to users quicker than we've ever seen before. But with that pace and that speed, we haven't necessarily had the time to go back and make the ethical decisions that we may have wanted to make as we started to use these technologies. So now we're starting to see a wave of different lawsuits hit the courtroom that are asking some questions about what's fair, what's ethical, and what's maybe downright dangerous when it comes to our use of artificial intelligence.
Look, all I'm saying is that we have to be careful.
Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma Roloff, and in this episode of Change in the Wild, we're going to be looking at the human side of AI and the ethical components that are starting to play out in the courtroom. The first case that I want to talk a little bit about was probably the biggest one that came on the scene and made a splash back in 2024. The New York Times sued OpenAI and Microsoft in a lawsuit alleging that OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT, used the New York Times' copyrighted articles as a part of their training data for their large language model. For those of you that aren't super familiar with the technology background side of this, ChatGPT is a large language model, which means that it has access to massive amounts of data from the internet that it then uses machine learning to parse through, recognize patterns, and learn from. And then as users, when we go and we ask it questions and start to interact with it, it can pull from that massive amount of data and patterns that it has recognized to generate responses to us. So in order for OpenAI to have created ChatGPT, they had to have access to tons and tons of information. And so this case is asking, is it fair use for OpenAI to use copyrighted material that New York Times has created in order to feed its model? And New York Times is saying, it's not fair, because when ChatGPT was released, and they became this source of knowledge and truth for a lot of people, they became a competitor of ours. People are no longer going and reading long form articles the same way that they did. They're now going to large language models like ChatGPT to ask questions and do research. And if it's pulling from their articles without any sort of agreement or permission from the New York Times, they're saying that is a no-go and not allowed.
That is totally not cool.
And so the implications of this case are going to be really looking at what is fair use for these AI models to be trained on. And do you have to have agreements in place to use copyrighted material? And this will have implications far beyond just large language models. It will also go into the sphere of tools that make AI-generated music or art, and whether it's okay for them to mimic the style of specific artists or writers. And it's really going to start to kind of like play out this balance of how do we look at innovation and intellectual property in the grander space of copyrighted information and what humans have created. But the case is also starting to heat up in a really interesting way just in the last couple of weeks. So like I mentioned, they initially issued the lawsuit back in December of 2024. But just this week, there was a ruling in the case that is allowing the New York Times to require OpenAI to keep massive amounts of data to be discoverable in the lawsuit. So looking at a statement from OpenAI on their website, they said, the New York Times is suing OpenAI. As a part of their baseless lawsuit, they recently asked the court to force us to retain all user content indefinitely going forward, based on speculation that they might find something that supports their case. We strongly believe that this is an overreach. It risks your privacy without actually helping resolve the lawsuit. That's why we're fighting it. So this case is probably going to get a lot more interesting and hit a lot more headlines as this idea of overreach, of sharing data and saving data indefinitely in a lawsuit starts to play out.
You are overstepping.
So now we're starting to see it becoming a data privacy question, beyond just the idea of fair use of the technology. There's also a similar lawsuit that has more recently hit the courtroom, where the social media platform Reddit is suing AI company Anthropic, who has the large language model Claude, very similar to ChatGPT. And Reddit is alleging that Anthropic went in and scraped Reddit comments and data without any sort of licensing or agreement in place, and that they didn't let Reddit users know that they were using their data. In the lawsuit, they get like a little bit spicy when they're calling Anthropic the late blooming AI company that bills itself as the white knight of the AI industry and says it is anything but, and that they're suing them for clearly not caring about Reddit's rules or its users, and that it believes that they are entitled to take whatever content it wants and use that content however it desires. And so this is not necessarily fair use because it's on a social media platform and it's content generated by users, but it asks the question of who owns public content. Does the platform own it? Does the creator own it? Does the individual whose data is being used to train this model own it? And is scraping data from public social media websites ethical use of that data? And are there any sort of implications that come from these platforms not having agreements in place with the social media platforms that they're kind of harvesting this data from? So these two cases are similar but different, asking different questions tied to the data that is behind these large language models. And as this starts to play out, again, these rulings may have major impact in terms of what these models are able to use as a part of their training and how these models have developed over time. Something like ChatGPT using New York Times training data at the very beginning could change the model substantially if they had to rework things and remove that information, or could result in a pretty massive payment to New York Times to allow OpenAI to continue to use that information as a part of their model. Recently, the New York Times just entered into an agreement with Amazon to do just that. So this might just play out as the ruling that if you want to use copyrighted information, you need to start paying for it. So an interesting piece for us to look at more in the fairness of use and ethical use of data in training our models. There are also some cases that come out of this in terms of how people are using chatbots and AI in the world as we're moving forward, and companies that are early adopters, and what happens when AI makes an error.
Cannot compute.
So Air Canada is being sued right now because they issued out a chatbot that was customer facing to answer common questions. And a customer went onto the website and asked it for a bereavement policy to figure out what they were going to be able to do with a plane ticket in the case of a death. And there was no training done on the bereavement policy, and the solution hallucinated and gave the answer that was not something that was in the company's actual policy. So now the question is playing out in the court system of how do we deal with outsourced decision-making, and if that decision-making is incorrect? And what kinds of safeguards do we have in place when maybe these decisions are very critical or costly? So in this case, it's a plane ticket, and the person that's suing wanted their plane ticket reimbursed, and Air Canada said no. But as this starts to play out and we see more and more AI uses for decision-making or outsourcing of decision-making, the outcome of this lawsuit could have pretty big ramifications moving forward. I've talked about this one a lot on TikTok, but the large HR platform Workday is currently being sued in a collective lawsuit from employees who applied to jobs through Workday that are over the age of 40. They are alleging that they were discriminated against based off of their age and information that was taken in off of their resume as a part of their application, and that the AI platform automatically denied them based off of age discrimination alone. This case is very early on, but it's going to ask a lot of questions of who's at fault if discrimination is present in a platform. Is it the company that developed it? Is it the company that's using it? How do we work through the designation of fault in a scenario like this when artificial intelligence is a part of the process? And it also starts to look at questions of how do we eliminate bias within our algorithms if maybe data of the past has had implicit bias in it. And so this one comes down to a lot of decisions that we're going to see when, again, decision making is outsourced to the AI platform itself. But I think the most interesting piece of this is, where does the fault lie when discrimination comes into place? And who's ultimately on the line when these solutions are being used and driving decisions that wouldn't be okay for a human to make. The last piece that I want to talk about is a little bit more sensitive and gets into the space of how we're using these tools and maybe why they might be dangerous. There is a platform called Character AI who's currently being sued after a young adult teenager took their life from a conversation that they had with their Character AI solution. The chatbot was involved in sexual conversations and reinforced suicidal ideology as the teen was talking to the platform. And the AI platform doesn't have any age checks or guardrails to try and keep this stuff from happening. And so this is a very serious case that's playing out right now that begs the question of, how should AI be used and what kinds of attachments may people, and specifically children, get to these different solutions as they're made more available? And who's at fault if these intimate relationships are created with AI without any sort of oversight?
And who is to blame for this?
And ultimately, how do we protect people from these dangerous situations, whether it's Character AI or conversations that are driving people to psychosis through therapy sessions with ChatGPT? There's a lot of really ethical gray area when it comes to the AI to human relationship that's going to start to play out over the next couple of years that we have to be thoughtful of. And cases like this are potentially going to impact that. So as we see these cases start to play out, we're going to come head to head with decisions that are talking about consent and control of these platforms. Who takes accountability or blame when something goes wrong? How do we avoid bias at scale and superpowering maybe what's already present in our data sets? When are we crossing the line with data privacy and protection? And ultimately, how do we safely use these tools without continuing to run into the same problems time and time again? I do not pretend to know the answers tied to all of these ethical questions associated with AI.
I don't have all the answers.
But this is really the human part of the technology. This is where we need to start with people before we implement tools. And we need to think about the people that are at the center of all of our technology use. And as a leader, if you're implementing a solution, make sure that you're asking a lot of questions that are tied to data privacy and bias that might be in the solution, and really thinking through things from all angles so that you don't end up at the center of one of these lawsuits scratching your head and wondering how you got here. Pay attention to the people alongside the technology. I think that's the ultimate answer. And if we start with people and move from there, we're at least going to be in better shape than we will be if we do it the other way around. Thanks so much for joining me again for this episode of Leading Change. If you like content like this about where real world examples are meeting digital transformation and change management theory, make sure to hit the subscribe button, give the video a like, and add a comment down below about your thoughts on these different cases and the ethical issues we're seeing playing out. I love to have these conversations, and I personally will make sure to go and respond to all the comments. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Until next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.